Okay, let's get started. So my name is Örjan Berlin. I'm at the Stockholm Seminars Center at Stockholm University, where I am now a professor of environmental science since a couple of weeks ago formally. Actually, it's a year, I think. So, but today, welcome to the Stockholm Seminar. And I have to use a note here because there's so many different organizations we should acknowledge for this seminar series. So the seminar series has been going on for quite some time and is being organized by the Royal Swedish Academy of Science. Obviously, that's what we are right now. But also in collaboration with the Bay Institute for Ecological Economics, the Anthropocene Laboratory. Sorry if I have to actually go through this in my note here. The Global Economic Dynamics and Biosphere Program. And then, of course, you have Alba Eco, Future Earth, and then finally the Stockholm Seminars Center. I hope I didn't miss anyone here. If I did, I apologize. Okay, so anyways, I shouldn't talk much about this. Too much here is we have our guest here, Michele Barnes. She's from, also have to look at the note here to make it right. So she's now at the College for Art, Society and Education at James Cook University since a year or something. But previously she was working at the Center of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies at the James Cook University for quite some time, I think. And we have known each other for, I would say, many years by now. We've been working together, doing several studies, several papers. Much of her work is related to small-scale fisheries, social dynamics, and resource-dependent communities across the world, basically, even though most of them being Southeast Asia and Africa. But also more recently, she's been working with climate adaptation and all that comes with that, more or less. Let's see, another common denominator that we have in our work is an interest in social structure and social networks, and how these different structures and networks relate to the stuff that I just mentioned here, but also learning, adaptation, obviously, but also transformation. And to plug something that you're going to mention in your talk, I think we had a paper with explicitly talked about social structures and how that could be related to transformative and also adaptive capacity. But I think that's it from my side. So more or less over to you. But I also want to say that the presentation will last for around 40 minutes. And then there will be time for questions and I will moderate them. And I'm also supposed to repeat your questions with the microphone. So think about trying to condense your questions to something that I can actually repeat. Okay, I think that's enough. Did I miss something? No. So very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with you today and get the chance to share some of my research with you. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters where I live and work in Australia and North Queensland. So this is Bindal and Woogarookaba territory and country, which has been unceded. And I just want to recognize and honor their elders, past, present, and emerging. Okay. So to start this talk today, I want to start with a simple fact. Humans are social beings, right? We are entrenched in a variety of social interactions from a very young age. We make friends, we form relationships, and these relationships are critically important for a variety of reasons. In other words, social networks matter. Right, all of us are simultaneously involved in multiple overlapping networks of friends, family, coworkers, and colleagues, and the interactions that we have with them influence our exposure to ideas, information, and resources, which can influence our attitudes and beliefs. Perhaps most importantly, social networks have been shown to have a profound influence on our behavior. They can also shape our opportunities for action, and oftentimes, actually, this happens in ways that we're not even aware of. This idea dates back to foundational work in sociology by George Simmel, who famously wrote, "Society arises from the individual, and the individual arises out of association." So as a social network scientist, unanswered questions about these relationships, what they mean, how they form, what the implications of them are definitely what I get super excited about. So, for example, I'm interested in questions such as, How does knowledge spread through society? How do social networks influence individual decision-making and behavior? And how do micro-level social interactions scale up to influence societal outcomes? So I primarily examine these questions in the context of grand societal challenges that primarily relate to the natural environment, such as climate change, because this is my personal interest. But the theories and methods that I engage with and the empirical insights and methodological advances that I've contributed to are relevant and have been applied across a range of different contexts and issues. For example, just my research group alone has current projects looking at responses to COVID-19, not only environmental governance, but also healthcare governance, and also looking at resilience in the tourism industry. So what I want to present today is really at the cutting edge of this field applied to some of society's biggest challenges, food security and climate change. So first, we're going to look at not only how the relationships between people, but also between people and the environment mediate cooperative outcomes. And we're going to do this by looking at the issue of food security in fishing communities. Next, we're going to shift to examining how a person's position in a social ecological network can influence their adaptive behavior in the context of climate change. So I'm going to wrap up with an overview of ongoing work and future directions. But first, what exactly is a social ecological network? To explain that, I need to first explain the concept of a social ecological system. And many of you will be intimately familiar with this idea, right? Many of the ideas about social ecological systems originated right here in Stockholm. But I want you to bear with me because I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page. So it's becoming harder to ignore the fact that we are living in a rapidly changing world, right? The climate is warming, populations of many species are in decline, forests are disappearing, and as a result, human societies are facing considerable risks to food security, livelihoods, and well-being. Now, importantly, these changes are often the product of complex linked dynamics between people and nature. From this perspective, environmental systems can be understood as complex social ecological systems, right? Simply put, this is comprised of an ecological unit, a social unit, and the interactions between them, right? So the idea is that ecological systems provide ecosystem goods and services that support society, so the arrow on the top, such as food, medicines, and waste cycling, while social systems feed back on ecological systems through modifying actions such as fishing or even ecosystem restoration, and that's the arrow on the bottom. So the idea really gets at the fact that what happens in one aspect of this system is tightly linked to what happens in the other, right? And it's often these complex interdependencies that underpin many important environmental problems today. And though these interdependencies in social ecological systems are now very well recognized, it's been really difficult for us to develop truly integrated frameworks and models that can actually capture some of this complexity and be applied to real-world sustainability issues at the same time. So one promising way forward draws on a multi-level network approach. Right, they're a really great fit for this problem because they allow us to capture important relationships in social systems, such as trust and knowledge sharing, key linkages in ecological systems, such as food webs and landscape connectivity. But they also, at the same time, allow us to capture the interactions between them, right? So things like resource extraction or even cultural ties to certain aspects of the environment. Now, full social ecological networks are incredibly complex, right? This is just one example from one of my study sites in Papua New Guinea, where you can see there are a lot of interdependencies between people and the environmental resources that they're interacting with and rely on. But these can be disassembled into smaller configurations or motifs that form the foundation for the larger network structure. Right, these configurations can highlight the presence or absence of key relationships within and between social actors or ecological resources that can be critically important for achieving certain types of outcomes in these systems. So over the past several years, I've been working with scholars from a range of disciplines to further this analytical approach. Some are pictured here, certainly not all of them, but a few of them, some of whom you may know. So we've been working on developing hypotheses and modeling approaches to describe and capture how specific network configurations support social processes that are important for achieving sort of these different types of outcomes. So just as an example, in one of our theoretical papers that Oriana actually mentioned at the beginning, we identified 7 configurations likely key for managing the commons, right? Where you sort of have multiple actors more or less using or often competing over shared or open access resources, right? And this happens all the time in things like fisheries, water, and climate. Okay, so in part 1 of this talk, I'm going to present results from the first multi-case comparative empirical assessment that we conducted, which demonstrates how one of these configurations actually relates to quantitative ecological conditions. So the context of this work was sort of a critical commons ecosystem that supports food security in East Africa. Specifically, we focused this work on coral reefs in coastal Kenya. So reefs are critical for supporting the livelihoods of millions of people across the globe and are a particularly critical source of food security in coastal Kenya. Yet they've been really difficult to manage sustainably. And there are a lot of issues facing reefs, but at the local level, overfishing is the most direct local threat. And that really does stem from this commons issue. We therefore sought to understand whether cooperative communication relationships amongst fishers who target the same fish species captured by this cross-level social ecological triangle depicted on the right related to more sustainable management of reefs, right? So it's sort of this idea that if would-be competitors are cooperating and sharing information and knowledge, then do we see better outcomes? So this multi-leveled network system captures critical interdependencies that exist between coastal fishers and the fish that they target and rely on for supporting food security and their livelihoods. So basically at the bottom, we have the B-level network, which is capturing trophic interactions among key target reef fish. So that's basically which fish eat other fish. The A-level network at the top captures knowledge sharing among fishers. And the X-level network, which links fishers to the fish species, basically it's just linking the fishers to the fish that they are targeting and using. So what we expected to find was that this network configuration would be positively related to ecological conditions, right? So we focus specifically on this configuration because it represents what we call a form of closure, right? So now we know that in social networks, the theory of closure emphasizes that tight coupling between actors facilitates trust, learning, and can help to establish common norms and sanction while minimizing uncertainty. Right, so what social ecological network closure does is it basically extends this coupling across the social ecological divide, right? Thus, the mechanisms or social processes that it might support include things like trust, a shared vision, and sustained commitments regarding the management of shared resources, such as agreeing on rules and developing conflict resolution mechanisms, all of which can help people overcome this commons dilemma and work toward improving ecological conditions. So we tested this using primary data from 5 sites in Kenya where reef fishing was the main source of food and income. So this is pretty unusual for a social network study using primary data, right? Because of the intense sort of data demands and requirements involved, most studies only ever focus on one location or community. But because in this case, we were interested sort of in these system level outcomes, we needed different sites to compare. So we did as many as we could. So I surveyed over 75% of all fishers in each site, and I found that fishers targeted a total of 36 different fish species using different gears, and these gears would often, but not always, overlap in target species. So in terms of outcomes, in collaboration with ecologists, we evaluated 2 different measures. So the first was fish biomass, which essentially captures how much fish there is on a reef. And the second was functional richness, which captures the diversity of fish on the reef and the different roles that those fish play in the ecosystem. So I also collected a lot of other data, which I'll talk more about later. So to test the role of this kind of closed cross-level social ecological triangle, I fit multi-level exponential random graph models to each site. So this is basically a network-specific model that models network structure as endogenous based on the assumption that network ties are conditionally dependent. So what that means is a network tie is basically depending on the existence of other network ties conditioning on the rest of the network. So just to explain that a bit better, the types of questions that people typically ask with using these types of models is sort of, what underlying micro-level structural features of the network are overrepresented or underrepresented compared to what we would expect to find in a random network of the same size and density, right? And thus are sort of laying the foundation for this larger structure that we're observing. So what we found using these models was that the closed cross-level social ecological triangle was disproportionately overrepresented in sites A through C. So they had more of these than we would have expected, suggesting that in these sites, fishers that target the same fish species were more likely to be cooperating. So aside from these results, we found little to no variation in the prevalence of other network factors across sites. So all had a negative and significant density parameter, which is just sort of accounting for how many ties people tend to have. And that's very normal in these types of networks. They all had a tendency toward closure in the social network, which is, again, very common in lots of different types of networks, and especially these types of networks. Leaders had a higher tendency of tie formation than others, which is, again, very common. And fishers tended to form ties with others who use the same landing site. That's sort of a spatial proximity homophily parameter. And that's, again, quite common. We've seen that in other similar type sites as well. So in the social ecological network, it seems that the closed cross-level social ecological triangle was really the only dominant network effect that varied across sites. So how did this relate to ecological conditions? So on the left here, I plotted percent pristine biomass in each site. So this is how close that resource base is to what we would expect to find in sort of a pristine, unfished location, which does not exist anymore anywhere, but it's just sort of used as a baseline still. So here on the right, I've plotted functional richness, which is, again, a measure of the functional roles that fish play in supporting ecosystem health. Now, obviously, we see variation here across sites. But importantly, when you compare sites with a strong tendency towards social ecological network closure to those without, you see that these differences are actually meaningful, right? So specifically, sites A through C actually had a significantly higher mean level of both biomass and functional richness than sites D and E. So our measures of ecological conditions lend support to this hypothesis that social ecological network closure is sort of associated with kind of improved or better ecological conditions. But huge caveat, this could be due to so many other factors, right? There are so many things that can affect how a coral reef fishery is performing and how it's doing kind of ecologically, right? So in an attempt to rule this out, we collected a lot of other data, right? So we looked at biophysical conditions and we found no significant differences across sites. We looked at environmental conditions, and again, we found no significant differences across sites. Next, we looked at sort of really basic human impact characteristics. So things like proximity to markets and fishing pressure. And again, we found no significant difference across sites. Finally, there are, of course, a range of social and institutional characteristics that can absolutely impact how our coral reef fishery is performing. And these are just some of them that were kind of made famous by Ostrom's design principles. So things like whether people have the ability to exclude outsiders, whether rules are adapted to local conditions, right? So we checked for all of these things. And again, we found no significant difference across sites, right? So though there can be a very big range of factors driving reef ecosystem conditions, the only thing that we really found in this case to differ across sites was this tendency toward social ecological network closure. So what's the takeaway here? What our results indicate is that this particular configuration, which is basically we're calling social ecological network closure, which is sort of a mouthful, but basically it captures these relationships amongst direct resource competitors. And it appears that these relationships do appear to be associated with positive ecological conditions in coral reefs, right? Which is critical, again, in this case, for supporting food security and in many regions around the world as well. Now, due to the high risk of respondent fatigue, given the ridiculously high amount of data that we were collecting, we weren't able to develop a super deep empirical understanding of the hypothesized mechanisms that support this relationship in our study site. However, we did collect some preliminary data to kind of get at this a bit. And looking at these data, we found that in sites that did not have this kind of social ecological network closure tendency, they had higher variations in trust. So they didn't have any difference in mean levels of trust, but less people agreed on whether others could be trusted. We also found that there were fewer rule commitments, and in some they had kind of no conflict resolution mechanisms or sort of a lack of a shared vision, right? So in summary, these preliminary results largely correspond to our theoretical predictions, adding further support to our initial hypothesis. So this study was published in Nature Communications, and it made a really significant contribution to the literature by executing sort of the first comparative empirical assessment of how these network structures relate to system-level quantitative sustainability outcomes. So it contributed to our understanding of this idea of network effectiveness, right, which has remained sort of rather elusive and incomplete across the network sciences more broadly. And this is largely due to the intense data demands, but also due to different conceptualizations of what effectiveness even means and in what context are we talking about and effective for who, right? And these are important questions that we still haven't answered in many cases. So there's still a lot of work to do in this space, and it remains sort of a feature of my work today. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what a multi-level social ecological network is and how it can help us to understand system-level outcomes, we're going to shift focus now to the individual level, sort of looking at how this network perspective can help us to better understand human behavior in the context of climate change. So we know that climate change is already affecting the daily lives of people all across the globe. This is a picture of the city that I live in, Townsville in North Queensland. So this was in 2019, was almost completely underwater due to what was described as a 1 in 100-year flood event. So the heavy downpours did not stop for almost 2 weeks, inundating nearly the entire city and leading to catastrophic loss of life and property. And things like this are happening now all across the globe. Now, to reduce these impacts, we clearly need urgent action on climate change at a global level. Yet, even if we take that action today, and we absolutely should, most of the world is going to continue to face impacts, right? People, therefore, need the capacity to respond in ways that reduce their risk and vulnerability. Now, whether and how people respond to environmental change, often referred to as adaptive behavior, is widely recognized to be driven by their adaptive capacity, which can be broadly defined as the underlying conditions that enable people to anticipate and respond to change, to minimize the consequences, to recover, and to take advantage of new opportunities. Now, even if after you read that definition, you're not exactly sure what adaptive capacity is, you are not alone, right? Adaptive capacity has been a particularly nebulous concept that has been really hard to pin down, never mind operationalize, right? And this has been due in part to the fact that it has been widely written about across many different disciplines, which oddly enough, sometimes don't really talk to each other very well, right? So over the past several years, some of my colleagues and I have actually been working on really trying quite hard to bring this kind of interdisciplinary scholarship together from across the social sciences and also the ecological sciences to develop a more comprehensive framework of adaptive capacity. So just introducing the framework now. Assets have long been identified as key for building adaptive capacity, and they tend to be the subject of many adaptation programs. Yet we emphasize in our framework that, finding from all the literature that we were reviewing, that whether and how people respond to change is also driven by things like whether they have the flexibility to change strategies or the power and agency to influence change or to make their own free choices in determining whether to change or not. It's also driven by socio-cognitive constructs, such as risk attitudes and cognitive biases. Finally, adaptive behavior can be influenced by the relationships or networks that bind people to each other and the environment, right? So these relationships not only shape processes of social influence, but they also determine whether and how people can access information, resources, and support. They also shape the context in which people learn to recognize change and strategically absorb, process, and synthesize information that they can use to make adaptive decisions. Now, over the last 15 years, there has been substantial progress in conceptualizing and measuring adaptive capacity. Yet, as I sort of alluded to before, most of this research has really focused on only one or two of these domains. And further, empirical research on climate and climate adaptation has often relied on kind of presenting people with hypothetical scenarios and asking them, what would you do if X or Y happened, right? So we actually still lack explicit empirical evidence demonstrating how these diverse domains of adaptive capacity simultaneously underpin actual adaptive behavior. So the goal of this next project that I'm going to be presenting to you is to begin building the empirical knowledge base in this area by testing the role of these different domains of adaptive capacity on responses to climate change. So we conducted this research on a small island fishing community in Papua New Guinea that has a population of approximately 750 people spread out among about 140 households. So the people living on this island are highly dependent on natural resources, particularly reef fish, to support their livelihoods. Yet the island is experiencing really dramatic impacts from climate change that threaten these resources. So things like extreme weather events, king tides, coastal inundation, and overall declines in reef fish. Now, in this context, we had a kind of massive effort where we integrated data from a full population census, semi-structured social surveys, key informant interviews, observed fish landings, and we also looked at published reports to document adaptive behaviors. So we classified behaviors in two different ways, adaptive and transformative. Now, acknowledging that there are still very heated debates in the literature regarding when or even if an action should be considered adaptive versus transformative in nature. Notwithstanding these arguments, these terms are increasingly being used in the climate change literature to describe different types of actions. So adaptive action is typically described as sort of minor to moderate adjustments to existing practices and behaviors, typically considered as sort of incremental and at least somewhat reactive. So following this definition, in our case, we defined adaptive action by including things like building a seawall to deal with coastal inundation or changing fishing practices to deal with declines in catch. So people are still sort of doing the same thing that they were doing before, but they're sort of buffering their risk, right? Transformative action is typically described as more fundamental changes that can alter dominant social ecological relationships and aid in creating sort of new systems or futures, typically classified as more anticipatory in nature and sort of considering the long term. So in our case, we coded actions as transformative if the household had diversified their livelihood approach by becoming engaged in atoll farming. So in this case, atoll farming represented a fundamentally new livelihood approach that had only been evolving just over the past few years in our study site. And before this, the entire community had only been fishing, you know, their parents fished, their grandparents fished, everybody fished, right? So this was very, very new here. We also considered active coordination of or engagement in long-term planning, such as developing resettlement schemes, as transformative. And so both of our outcomes were binary, so we kind of treated them as such, right? So a household either undertook an action considered adaptive and or transformative, or they did not. And that was primarily for modeling reasons, but also because we were sort of interested in just what was sort of driving these types of behaviors rather than understanding sort of the way that the behaviors interacted. But I think that that would be a really interesting sort of follow-up. So we used the information that we collected to develop 20 key indicators representing those 6 broad domains of adaptive capacity that I introduced earlier. So as you can see, our indicators included social and economic characteristics such as wealth and risk perceptions, but they also included a household's position in a complex multi-level social ecological network, which we use to capture aspects of both organization and learning. So again, the idea rests on the notion that I introduced previously, which is that social relationships between people can influence their attitudes and behavior, right? So this can be thought of as sort of a network exposure effect. Now, in addition to these social relationships, the relationships that people have with the environment, right, with specific resources or groups of resources, can also be important for several reasons, right? They can facilitate learning, for example, about climate-induced changes in the ecological environment. So drawing on theories of adaptation, transformation, and a growing body of work that is now kind of come about on social ecological networks, we tested a total of 8 theoretically grounded network configurations, which are depicted here. Now, I don't have time to describe each of them in detail, but you'll see kind of broadly that we gathered information on a social ecological network that is quite similar to the one that I explained in the previous example, since this was also a fishing community. We then tested for general levels of connectivity, network exposure, as well as a range of different configurations that sort of represent closed or open structures that we argued would kind of theoretically facilitate adaptive or transformative action by providing access to information, resources, and by providing opportunities for learning. So to model adaptive and transformative outcomes, we extended the functionality of the autologistic actor attribute model to account for multi-level networks, right? So the difference between this model and the one I presented in the previous example is that this model treats the network structure as exogenous, right? So what that does is it allows us to simultaneously test how an individual household's adaptive behavior may have been constrained or facilitated by, one, their position in that multi-level social ecological network, two, the behavior of other people in that network, and three, also all of those other components of adaptive capacity that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so what did we find? This is the exciting part, right? So here, everything in white with a star was significant for predicting adaptive action in our model, and everything in yellow with a star was significant for both adaptive and transformative action in our models. So interestingly, we found that none of our indicators of assets or flexibility were significantly related to our studied responses, whereas organization, socio-cognitive factors, agency, and learning were all important to some extent. Now, today I want to focus on the cross-cutting effects, right? So these are the ones that were important for both adaptive and transformative action. So we tested different aspects of social networks, right? Such as people's position in the network and whether they had ties to external actors. And interestingly, the only thing that we found to be important was network exposure, right? Which was positively significant for predicting both adaptive and transformative action. So what this essentially means is that if I had social ties to someone that had adapted or transformed, I was more likely to as well, simply put. Now, in terms of the social ecological ties, two structures associated with learning were significant in our models, configuration G and I that we are shown here. So we argue that configuration G, which is where you have one household linked to interconnected resources, basically we argue that that allows people to sort of internalize ecological feedbacks and therefore potentially get a bigger picture of ecological changes that are happening within the environment. While configuration I, we argue, may enable social learning about broader trends in the environment because it links two different households that are linked to sort of many different independent resources, right? So importantly, both of these configurations can potentially reduce the uncertainty that is often associated with environmental change, thereby prompting people to take action. Now, perceived influence or power was also important for both responses, but this is the only instance in which we found the effects to actually be at odds with each other. Now, specifically, when a household felt that they had more power to influence the management of ecological resources, they were more likely to have taken some sort of adaptive action, but less likely to have engaged in more transformative action. Now, one potential explanation for this is that powerful actors may be potentially working against transformations because their power is actually established in the current system, right? So these types of societal shifts would actually undermine that or potentially threaten that. So what does all of this mean? Now, the implications of this study are tightly coupled with sort of our ongoing and future work. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump to that now. So this was the first empirical study that simultaneously examined indicators of all those different domains of adaptive capacity on responses to climate change. But my research group and other people as well have been very busy applying this framework since. So the context that we've been looking at it include extreme weather events affecting tourism in the Indo-Pacific, climate change impacts on fisheries in Spain, and behavioral responses to COVID-19 in Kenya. We've also expanded the framework in sort of a co-produced research with stakeholders in the Great Barrier Reef region to examine governance responses to mass coral bleaching. So it's been sort of scaled as well. Now, the common theme that is emerging from this work is that across these many different contexts, These complex human behavioral domains, right, things like social organization, agency, learning, and socio-cognitive constructs are really showing up as the dominant drivers of adaptive behavior in many, many different contexts. Yet, as many of you may know, climate adaptation programs, which currently attract $30 billion in funding annually across the globe now, and that number is only going to rise, are often very heavily focused on financial assets and flexibility. For example, the UN Environment Program alone has funded 75 climate adaptation projects in over 50 countries, most of which have focused on things like building infrastructure, providing insurance, and introducing new practices and livelihood options. And in many cases, these have been really critical programs, right? And oftentimes they're actually creating situations where people may not have to adapt as much because they're providing a buffer. So certainly nothing wrong with that at all. But they really have overlooked these more complex human behavioral domains that, as it turns out, are really critically important for whether individuals are going to be taking action or not, right? So there's a lot of work to do, I think, in better understanding how these behavioral domains interact to shape people's adaptive behavior in different contexts, and in identifying ways that this information can actually be used practically to support adaptation outcomes. And so this is where some of my work is headed now. I was actually at the climate adaptation conference last week in Montreal, so that was really, really great to sort of engage there. Now, another area of my work has begun to explore sort of how networks evolve over time in the context of global change. Now, empirical data capturing this has been incredibly sparse, aside from some social media data, which is useful for answering some questions, but not so useful for others. So I've started collecting longitudinal panel data in many of my study sites. And using the very first round of this data that I collected, a group of colleagues and I recently demonstrated that in the context of global change, people in one of my study systems in Papua New Guinea were showing a strong increasing preference for forming bonding ties with like-minded similar others, right? This is what I refer to as bunkering down, which is sort of a twist on hunkering down. So this is actually really important because too much bunkering down in networks can lead to increasing polarization. And we've seen what that can do all across the world, right? It can be really detrimental for cooperation, which particularly across groups, which can be critical for actually meeting these grand challenges that we're facing. So that's a bit concerning, but how prevalent this response is across different contexts remains an open question. And we're sort of trying to explore that as well now. Now, I want to conclude this talk with a quote that I came across when I was young, growing up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. So this is from John Muir. He's sort of thought of as an influential environmental philosopher and the founder of the modern conservation movement. So he said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. So my research focuses on how people and the decisions that they make are hitched or attached to the rest of the world, including both their social and natural environment, and what the implications of these connections are for society's biggest global challenges. And finally, I just have to put a little plug here that I run a joint lab group with Josh Sinner in Australia, who you may have heard of. It's called Social-ecological adaptation and linkages, or C-links for short. And we have a big kind of hiring thing coming up. He has gotten a huge grant and will be hiring 3 to 5 postdocs and 4 PhD students, and I'll be hiring, I think, 1 or 2 postdocs as well soon. So definitely get in touch if any of this type of research interests you. Just to be clear, the big project that he got funding for is focused on reef sustainability and resilience, and he'll be hiring both ecologists and social scientists. So definitely get in touch if you are interested. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. It was great to be here.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, great talk. So now we have time for questions. And as I said before, if you can, since I have to repeat them for the Zoom people, if you want to have a short speech, go ahead, but then try to summarize that in the question at the end. Okay. So who wants to start?
I have one question from a person online. So it's from Michele. Who's asking, in the second study that you presented, can you tell us about the external validity of your results? For example, if you were to repeat the study but instead of households in an island, you get municipalities, cities, or businesses in a country, the next level of aggregation. Would you expect similar qualitative trends to emerge?
So we don't need to repeat
I
that
don't
one,
think
do
to
we?
repeat that one since you are talking directly with the microphone, right? Because I have
never
no idea
checked.
how to condense that in the question.
Yeah, no, you can go ahead.
Okay, good. Over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, great question, Juan. So we have I have quite a few students that have been applying this framework to many different contexts. I did mention toward the end of the talk, and they've found very similar results in terms of the different domains of adaptive capacity that tend to be influencing adaptive behavior. So when we first did that very first study, the one I showed or talked about here, we weren't quite sure about the external validity. I mean, we did make the argument that likely in other kind of small scale fishing communities, particularly throughout the Pacific, that you'd likely find similar dynamics. You know, we've worked in a lot of different places like that throughout not only the Indo-Pacific, but also, you know, throughout West Africa, East Africa. So we thought in those cases, given our experience, we suggested you'd probably find similar results. But, you know, now we're seeing that this is actually scaling in very different contexts in terms of those broad domains being relevant. Obviously, the indicators that you use for those are very different depending on the context. But yeah, we're finding similar results in terms of those broad domains being critical. So I hope that answers your question.
Let us know.
Okay, good. Thank you. So,
thank you very much. I liked the presentation very much. And make the observation that there are two diversities that we have handled. One is the diversity of functionality, which is the big blob with the side blobs. And then you also, rightly so, in the beginning, but not pursuing it very much, is the stratification at levels, geographic levels, or you could say power-related structures. So there is a sort of vertical and horizontal types of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
So now the question has to do with the linking of this. And the linking might be focused on a sort of curiosity question. What do you say about the differences in the vertical scaling in relationship to the diversity expansion you did in the functionality type of horizontal level?
okay, so I am exerting some adaptive capacities now, which means that I think it makes most sense if you pose the question. Since you are the one, you know, answering it, though, instead of me translating that and then you translating what I'm
Yeah,
saying
okay,
in English.
Great, thank you so much for the question. So I believe the question is about integrating different issues of diversity across scales and levels, right? So it's sort of thinking about, I guess, you know, maybe plainly put, if you're thinking about different power hierarchies that might be, you know, linking up from communities up to governance levels, or you might be thinking about power dynamics within communities, which is also sort of more flat or horizontal in terms of that way of conceptualizing it. And these are all incredibly important. It really, really important to understand because, you know, for just as an example, the coral reef communities that I worked in a lot before when I was at the Coral Reef Center, you know, they're small. And when you get there, you might think that they're sort of doing their own thing and not really affected by external actors or whatnot, but they are entirely, they're affected by global markets. They're affected by policies that are being driven at higher scales, right? So, and there's all sorts of dynamics happening within the community as well. And so thinking about how all of that together is influencing outcomes is a great question that I definitely don't have a good answer for, but it's something that, you know, we struggle with, I think, now to try to figure out how to incorporate all of it, even just getting to the point where we could do what we did with our two studies I presented today in detail, took a lot of effort with like ecologists and people on the ground and us, network modelers, and we had engineers for some stuff. I mean, it was a crazy effort, but there's so much more to do. And I think that question touches on just the amount of work we still have to do. And the fact that network thinking, I think, is a way to help us get there, right? Because it does allow us to incorporate a lot of different levels. And so I think that that's one approach that we could take, but I think it needs to be coupled with other approaches as well to really answer that question. Particularly qualitative methods would be really helpful for getting at some of those dynamics too. So I hope that answers the question.
Mixed methods approaches are encouraged. Okay, good. Question from the
so now it's David Kerner who's asking, how do technological factors, that is some people having access to faster boats, modern fishing gear, etc., affect social ecological networks? And then he adds, meaning, do the skewing capabilities and access to them affect the social ecological networks closure?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I'm just clarifying, do I need to repeat it, or that's
no?
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is a good question. So this is getting at what is actually driving the formation of the network, right? And so I think that is a really great question. There has been quite a bit of work on what drives the formation of social networks, and in small scale fisheries, there are some people that are usually in the middle of networks that tend to be very central, that others connect to a lot. And oftentimes they are people with resources like fast boats, but they're also, sort of leaders and whatnot. But in terms of how that might affect the social ecological network, I think it would probably be just as dominant. So I don't think anyone's actually studied that exact question, like access to technology and how it's influencing the formation of a social ecological network. But I think that I would expect to see very similar dynamics in terms of what we're seeing in the social network. But it would be an interesting question to explore.
Excellent. So I saw a hand with you.
My name is Tara. I'm from the University. Thank you very much for a very nice talk. And it was kind of eye-opening for me to stand the social network theory to ecological systems as well. So thank you very much. I have a rather clarification question. You said that social ecological network closure, but is that notion closer to bonding type or bonding social capital expanded to socio-ecological system? Is that the way to understand it, or is it slightly different with bonding and imaging?
Yeah, perfect. So the question is, the social ecological network closure concept that I introduced, it is a way to think about it kind of similar to what we talk about as bonding social capital or bonding networks, right? And the answer is yes. And that's how we sort of described it a bit also in our paper, was that, because theories about, we're bringing in theories about social relationships as well as social ecological relationships to try to understand these different structures. And social capital theory is one of the theories that we did bring in to try to help understand that idea of bonding. And that's why when I sort of represented that theory of closure in the social network, in a lot of social science work that has been linked with theories of bonding. I will just add the caveat, though, that the way that people conceptualize bonding can sometimes be different. Like if you have a certain triangle structure, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to have what people would consider bonding social capital, right? So I think you just need to be a bit careful about like what's actually happening in the relationship. But the easy answer is yes, there is a connection there.
But then if that is the case, it's natural when you said at the end that it's kind of concerning with climate change and transformative change, these bonding ties are not really working.
Right. That's really interesting. So now she's using my own words against me. It's what's happening. But so the question now is, when you think about bonding potentially being good in the first example, but then it's potentially bad in the second example. So why is that? Is sort of the question, right? And I think that right. So yes, that's actually a really good point. In the first question, we linked it to ecological outcomes, and we were able to see that there was a positive impact on, or a positive relationship, I should say, with ecological conditions. Whether that is going to be something that becomes problematic in the long run is unclear. At the time that we did the study, it seemed to be having a positive outcome. It was bringing would-be competitors sort of together. But in the other case, it's a very different context. So in the first case, you have a lot more diversity of people involved in general, a lot of different gears and a lot of different types of people, and the communities are a bit more, there's like more migrants and more kind of movement. Whereas in the second case, it is a really small island community where one of the biggest problems is not having cooperation amongst clans, which they used to. So they sort of have had this really big breakdown of like traditional tenure and customary management. And so things have really gotten tough there. And so I think the context is really important for interpreting that. And I didn't really have time to get into that in the talk, but really great question. And I hope that answers it.
Excellent. I just want to comment on that.
Yes,
From a Swedish contextual perspective. So you can say that the amount of social capital, bonding social capital you need, it's like you should have some of it, but maybe not too much of it. You should have just lagom. Not too much, not too few, just at the right spot. Lagom. Okay, good. Any more questions? I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned in your last study there that power was more associated with adaptive instead of transformative capacity, and you mentioned one of the reasons could be like if you are better off, you might be less willing to change things depending on how they are, less willing to initiate transformative action. Though I totally agree with that, but I can also think about another mechanism. Could be that if you are more well off, you might be more able to adjust. Some of those more adaptive measures like building a seaboard take some resources, and if you have resources, you might be more able to do that. Whereas if you are so well off, the only choice you have is actually to transform.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. We did actually account for that in the assets component of at least some more kind of basic measures of like being well off, right? So the agency one was more about whether people had power in the system to actually make changes and make decisions about that system and what was going to happen and what the community should be doing. So it was a bit different than being well off, I guess, in that more, I guess, in that sense. Yeah, if that makes sense.
It's also an illustration that power in itself is a multi-dimensional concept. So
it's true. Yeah.
If you're well off, you usually can be associated with more power.
Yeah.
But it's much more than that.
Yeah. In this case, we separated those just, to make sure that we were sort of capturing different things there.
Excellent.
I thought that was the most interesting part. So really interesting. But can you just explain a little bit more about how you operationalize power?
Yeah. So in this case, so it was definitely not an in-depth study of power, which, current and ongoing work is looking much more in depth into power, and especially power in networks. I think this is a really important area of research. But this one was really simple, and it was just, do they feel that? So it was more of like if people felt that they had the power and the agency over decision making in that system, and to be clear, the decisions that were being made were ones that were very important and had significant impacts on their livelihoods. So it was things about the resource system, how they should be managing that, what they should be doing, what the community, how the community should be adapting and making decisions, right? So it was a really important forum for them and for their livelihoods. And so it was asking people directly their perceived power in that system.
Excellent. Any more questions? Lanka?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michele. Very important. Yeah, with amazing synthesis of all the work. I was just wondering if you have thoughts about that research has shown as well that different types of relations can be related to different types of relations. The more adaptive or more transformative. Some of trust, the first relation is communication. So I wonder if you have any thoughts or tell us a bit about how these different relationships matter, and you are considering in your research to account for this diversity of relations within the conversation.
Yep. Yeah, great. So the question is about different types of relationships and the role that they might play in different types of responses to change, climate change, other environmental crises, perhaps. And it's a really important question, really spot on. And yes, we actually have ongoing work right now where we're collecting, I think, like 10 different types of relationships in the same sites that we were working in before, to try to get an understanding of what's of how this not only how they influence people's responses to change, but just also understanding how the community is structured in a much more deep way, rather than just like, who are you sharing knowledge with, right? Which is in the kind of social network research related to the environment, the questions have often focused on knowledge sharing and advice, access to information and advice, which is understandable. And that's been really useful in a lot of ways. But I think that there is a lot to learn about the social structures of these communities and of other communities as well, looking at other types of relationships. And I think that they do have a really important role. And so we're interested in looking at that. And we've started collecting that data. We have not been able to put any papers out on it yet, because we want to do dynamic stuff. So we're going in for a second round before we analyze. So that's been something that we are working on. I did have a student though that was working on this as well. We did some work in Spain, Diego Selvera Arturo. So he has published a few papers, and he had looked at different types of relationships. He looked at knowledge sharing as well as trust. And in one of them, we did social ecological network stuff, and we did find that they had different impacts. So I believe that paper's in Scientific Reports, if I could, yeah, if I guess email me if you're interested, and I can send it to you.
And he actually spent some time in Stockholm Seminars.
Oh, did he? Yeah,
He
great.
was here for I don't know how long, but sometime. Okay, good. One more question here.
Yes, so another question from David Turner. How might the social-ecological network social model endure in the face of greater complexity? That is a stochastic, unpredictable, or more chaotic context?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And it's also something that I am super fascinated by. In general, I'm really interested in dynamics of these networks over time. And in particular, a lot of my work is focusing on climate change. So of course, I'm interested in disaster shocks, exogenous shocks, right? So this is something that I am looking to explore in my future work. And I'm actually developing a big kind of project proposal for exactly that kind of work right now. So I will let you know once I find out.
Excellent, good. So we are getting close to 3 o'clock, and I think it's time to close the more official session now. But I just want to say that Michele is going to stay here until the end of the week. So if you want to have a one-to-one session with her, you let her or me know. We can probably arrange that. And also, if you want to continue some discussions right here, you can stay here. But otherwise, you are free to go.
Thank you so much, everyone.
And thank you very much. Excellent.
Thanks.
Oh, there you go. I didn't trust that. Oh, I didn't expect
Oh, great. I would, yeah, I would.